Hello, hello, hello. Today we are going to paint Iron Kong made by Kotobukiya, 1/72nd scale. I'm going to try out object source lighting, very trendy nowadays, or OSL for short, and that basically means trying to create the illusion of light with just paint. So let's begin. So we kick off with the first stage, which is priming your model, specifically priming everything black. I use a spray can for this, and I try to get this in all the crevices because this will help to add to the shadow effect and enhance the three-dimensionality of the overall work. Later, I'll use a light grey primer for where the light hits the model and we'll get a good contrast between light and dark. I've also made a base to go along with it using foam, pla plate and some cork. The cliche narrative here being Iron Kong causing some mayhem on top of the building, and later on I'll add a helicopter crashing by his feet, causing big ol' explosion, which is our primary light source. I paint the whole base black and I'll set Iron Kong up on top once I'm done. Now I'm spraying the grey primer at a 45-degree angle downwards, and that's fine for most dioramas with regular daytime light. However, this is probably a slight mistake in hindsight because I wanted this scene to be in the night time, so the moonlight is only a secondary light source. The explosion by his feet, now that's the main light source, so I really should be spraying the grey primer bottom up for Iron Kong instead of top down. Nonetheless, this is how it looks all primed up and ready for stage 2, painting the base coat. Now the second stage is painting the base coat, and this is where most of my time was spent. I use a paintbrush and vallejo paints for this. Throughout the process, I try to bear in mind where the light sources are and how they interact with the form of this model. There are two light sources here, an explosion by his feet and the surrounding ambient moonlight from the top. To create more contrast, I want the light from the explosion to be yellow and the moonlight to be blue. I start with the areas illuminated by moonlight. I usually work from dark to light, so I start with purple and I try to get to those areas which are closest to the shadow area. This is then layered over with blue and cyan for the panels closer to the top where the secondary light source, moonlight in this case, is likely to reach. I'm not worrying too much about perfectly rendering the colors and its transition at this stage. I just want to block those colors in. By the end of this phase, I can take a look at the whole model, just make a quick evaluation to see if the lights and darks are appropriately placed. If I want to rework a section, I can do so knowing I haven't wasted much time and effort in painting one section perfectly prior. Now, while watching this process, some of you may be wondering how I pinned Kong to the base. For this, I used a 5mm square rod to fix him to the base, which has another slightly bigger square rod. I have to use epoxy putty to secure the rods in place, and this second rod is hollow, so it can accommodate the first. I initially thought maybe having a rod going through his leg so you don't see any attachment points. But because Kong is just a bit too top heavy, it will probably create too much strain on his hip, so a better option would be through the pelvis instead. I'll just need to figure out how to hide the rod in the base later on somehow, because I think it destroys the illusion a little bit. A square rod is preferable to a circular one to prevent any unnecessary rotation on an axis once mounted. Special thanks to Domenico Febo for this idea. I think he wrote an article or two in a book called In Combat, published by MO explaining this process of pinning Gundams. So please check it out. And no, I'm not sponsored by them, in case you're wondering. I just think pinning your models is important, not just in terms of stability, but it also contributes to the dynamism in the composition of the diorama. I also start to work on the base at this stage, and this helicopter you see here is a 172 hasegawa apache. Initially, I thought maybe a green color would work quite well for the helicopter and the building, but then I remembered Kong and the rest of the base are lit up by the same light sources, so if Kong is going to be having shades of blue and purple, then the base will need enough of that color to make everything cohesive. So what you see here, I'll later be reworking them so it has a stronger bluish and purplish hue to it. Also, if you're wondering why I'm filming this in portrait instead of landscape, the reason is because I intended to make YouTube shorts at first, so I optimize all my camera settings for that, but by the end of the project, I decided against it. I think a full video might be better so I can explain my thought processes more thoroughly. And you can let me know whether you think a full-length video is preferable or if shorts are the way to go. And then I also move on to the areas which receive the most light. Now these are the areas closest to the explosion. That's the helicopter, Kong's hips, most of his inner legs. The brightest areas are painted with a mix of yellow and white. And then I transition to the orange and a bit of red. Now the darkest areas have a bit of magenta mixed in with the red because this magenta will help to bridge the areas between the yellow and red from the explosion to the purple and blue from the moonlight. Now at this point I just did a quick check on the overall paint job and I'm quite satisfied with how it's going. With that said, I now focus on more layers of paint and rendering each transition of light to dark more carefully so there will be less brushstrokes visible. Now at times I have to use a smaller paintbrush and thinner coats to achieve this. I expect these areas to eventually end up yellow or orange in the end, and you might recall me painting it purple a few moments ago. The reason for this is instead of adding black to create the dark color for the shadow, a better option would be to use a complementary color as an undercoat, which is purple in this case. You may already know this. If you mix two complementary colors together, you'll probably get tones of gray or brown. This gray or brown color is what makes colors work harmoniously with each other. By layering the purple underneath its complementary yellow and orange color in the following stages, I'm essentially mixing them. When I first started this hobby, I spent a lot of time coming up with color schemes, but the end result appeared a bit jarring. It's almost as if the colors chosen don't work well in unison, and it's hard to figure out why. I was later taught that by mixing a bit of each color together, the resultant mixture will have some gray or brown, which is generally more cohesive than two pure colors put side by side. Aside from the actual hue, value is also important. Value is a fancy way of saying brightness, and this brightness changes depending on the form. Scale models are already three-dimensional, but to properly show off the shape and contour of the subject, we want to ensure there is a range of very dark to very bright. And there has to be enough contrast between them, because that's how our brain understands form. And what we do understand, we tend to like more. The most important part of a figure should be Iron Kong's head. I like the way some light from the explosion comes up from below to create some drama. The rest of his head is illuminated by the moon, so there's some blue near the back of his head. I decided his visor should be a green hue since we haven't seen that much green yet, and this should tie in nicely with the base. The green is also complementary to the red light near the mouth and jaw area, and that makes it stand out even more. Now interestingly, this is also a third light source, so the areas surrounding the visor have a hint of green to make it seem like some of that green has reflected around it. And that will conclude the second stage, painting base coat. The last stage is edge highlighting, which is to define the edges with a very light color, light green in this case, so that each panel is clearly distinct and helps the viewer make sense of where each armor plate starts and ends. This works quite well with the panel line wash because the panel line wash emphasizes shadows in the crevices, whereas the edge highlighting does the opposite. It helps to enhance the highlight on the very topmost surface of the model. Because Kong is so large, it took a lot of time, but the results are well worth it and adds to the overall look of the model. Have a look at this photo. The one on the left having received this edge highlighting treatment versus none on the right. I think by the end of this project, there are still a few areas I could touch up on to help smoothen the color gradations, but I'm mostly satisfied. If I were to do this again, I would have the building at a 45-degree angle to really try to sell the narrative that Kong is the last one standing. That makes the level of destruction more severe. Also, when it comes to the overall OSL effect, I think I need to push the highlights even more than what I've done here. it will probably be more eye-catching that way. Nonetheless, I'm generally quite pleased with how it all came out. It's a learning process for sure. Why don't you guys let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.